A U.S. Air Force plane on a bombing run over North Vietnam. The sophisticated might of American technology in a futile effort to prevent communist forces from taking over South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese use everything they can to try to bring down the Americans. Many times they succeed. Before the U.S. pulled out of Vietnam, more than 500 Americans were captured, prisoners of war, most of them aviators. Many would not come home for years.
God bless America. God bless.
The air war in Vietnam and the POW, the prisoners of war, on this edition of the 20th century. I'm Mike Wallace. When the war began, no one thought that a third world, pre-industrialized country like North Vietnam could withstand the pummeling from the sky that the United States Air Force and Navy would deliver. We had, after all, the finest planes, flown by the finest pilots in the world. In the end, American planes dropped almost 7.5 million tons on Vietnam, more than 3 times the total tonnage dropped on Germany and Japan in World War II, all in a futile effort to bend the will of the North Vietnamese.
We do this to convince the leaders of North Vietnam and all who seek to share their conquest of a very simple fact. We will not be defeated. We will not grow tired. We will not withdraw, either openly or under the cloak of a meaningless agreement.
It began slowly. In response to reported torpedo attacks on U.S. destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin, American planes struck North Vietnam for the first time in August of 1964.
Repeated acts of violence against the armed forces of the United States must be met not only with alert defense, but with positive reply. That reply is being given as I speak to you tonight.
The initial raid changed little. The North Vietnamese continued infiltrating men and materiel south. The South Vietnamese government teetered on the brink of collapse. Johnson's military leaders urged massive raids on the north, bond them back to the Stone Age, said Air Force General Curtis LeMay. But Johnson and his civilian advisors didn't want to provoke Hanoi's allies, China and the Soviet Union, into entering the war. So they settled on a gradually escalating bombing campaign against limited military targets. The Viet Cong raid on the American base at Pleiku in February of 1965 provided a perfect pretext to begin their new policy.
Good evening. This is a special report on what happened today in Vietnam and on the crisis the world is facing there tonight.
At 7:45 p.m. last night, a meeting of the National Security Council was held here in the Cabinet Room. By 9 p.m., the decision had been made to retaliate by bombing at least one target in North Vietnam. President Johnson issued another statement indicating that whether it was our intention to do so or not, the war in Vietnam might be widening anyway.
The series of retaliatory airstrikes against the North, Operation Flaming Dart, became Operation Rolling Thunder, a continuing bombing campaign that was to last 3 years. The expanded bombing changed the nature of the war overnight.
2 reinforced battalions were landed, a total of more than 3,500 men. They are the first actual ground combat troops to enter the country. All other American military men are technically classified as advisors. The Leathernecks swelled the number of American troops to over 27,000. Mission, security of the giant air base at Da Nang, the base from which airstrikes against the North are initiated.
the bombing expanded.
2 days ago, fuel depots around Hanoi and Haiphong that under an unspoken agreement had been spared American bombs were spared no longer. Petroleum storage tanks only 3.5 miles from the North Vietnamese capital were hit. Never before had U.S. warplanes struck so close to Hanoi itself.
Each escalation served only to increase the growing chorus of doubts about the wisdom of the air campaign.
You destroy the entire oil potential of North Vietnam. In my judgment, you've done very little to hurt the infiltration of troops and supplies from the north to the south. You've done nothing to curtail the potential of the Viet Cong, and to me, this is more a psychological gesture than it is a legitimate military effort.
But the bombing went on. Missions against North Vietnam more than quadrupled between 1965 and 1967, but in that time, North Vietnamese infiltration nearly tripled. And even though the Pentagon estimated that most major targets had been destroyed by 1967, President Johnson expanded the target list to include factories and power plants within 10 miles of the Chinese border. Johnson always insisted on great care in planning the missions to avoid hitting civilians and provoking a wider war.
This is the center of the target selection process, Pacific Headquarters in Hawaii. The commanders in Vietnam of the 7th Air Force and the Navy carriers at sea send here their proposals for new targets or changes or concentrations of attack to meet tactical moves by the North Vietnamese. These target officers in Hawaii may drop some of the suggestions from the field or add proposals of their own, then forward the whole package to the Joint Chiefs in Washington. The chiefs run the final screening, ruling out some targets perhaps, adding some of their own or checking others for White House approval.
Good morning, gentlemen. Your target for this afternoon, as advertised, is the Mo Trang Railroad Bridge, North Vietnam. The geographical coordinates are 213030 north, 1060750 east. Your route into the target from Da Nang, through standard refueling over the Gulf of Tonkin, coasting in on the island point as shown, staying well clear of the Communist Chinese border. You will then ingress.
You drop the bombs,
north,
you don't know what you've really done, so it's not like being on the ground with a M16 in your hand and you're actually shooting at people. We don't know the total casualties or what has happened. All we know is that we were assigned, like pick a number, that was our job. We go out and we drop the bombs.
But despite their best effort, inevitably some civilians were hit.
I found my husband was wounded. The villagers immediately sent him to hospital. And I continue together with the villagers to search for the three of my children. And we found two of them died in the center. And I could not find the third one. And at last I found just a part of his body. In that raid, in that attack, three of my children was killed. They are 11 years old, 7 years old, and 5 years old.
The summer and fall of '67 was really the height of the air war in Vietnam. To fly on a mission, even to Haiphong or in the Hanoi area, you were bound to encounter a lot of surface-to-air missiles. The Vietnamese were good at what they did, and we were taking significant losses in those days. The Vietnamese had concentric rings around Hanoi, 3 of them, of surface-to-air missile emplacements. So, and the Russians had trained them well, so they were very effective. And according to folklore, Hanoi was the most heavily defended against air of any place in the history of air warfare.
Hanoi also became adept at protecting its civilian population.
People popped into holes all over the city. into the little individual shelters which are spotted every few feet like open manholes. The people stand up to their shoulders in them like characters in a Beckett play, waiting to see whether the alert comes to anything before they pull the covers over their heads.
I think psychologically, up until 72 bombing helped them because our bombing was very limited, as you know, and not effective at all. And they, by being able to shoot down American airplanes, by being able to carry on under the duress of the American bombing campaign, probably helped them in their morale. It involved then every Vietnamese in the war effort, and here was the visible sign of the American aggressor.
And in the United States, bombing of North Vietnam became one of the great rallying points in the anti-war movement.
Since February 1965, our military operations have included selective bombing of military targets in North Vietnam. Our purposes are three: to back our fighting men by denying the enemy a sanctuary, to exact a penalty against North Vietnam for her flagrant violations of the Geneva Accords of 1954 and 1962, to limit the flow or to substantially increase the cost of infiltration of men and material from North Vietnam. All of our intelligence confirms that we have been successful.
But American intelligence confirmed just the opposite. If some factories were demolished, supplies were shipped in from China and the Soviet Union. If transportation was destroyed, men and material moved south by bicycle and on foot. If bridges were cut, the North Vietnamese rebuilt them. Case in point, the Doomer Bridge over the Red River near Hanoi.
They've rigged a pontoon bridge. By day, this bridge is dismantled. The pontoons moored and camouflaged beside the riverbank. Then in the late afternoon, when they think the danger of bombing has become less acute, they tow the pontoons up and put them into place. It takes an hour and a half from the time the sections leave the riverbank until the bridge is assembled. They put it together and take it apart like this every day.
Contrary to American expectations, the bombing did not bring Hanoi to the bargaining table. The war dragged on. Something had to happen. And as 1967 turned into 1968, something did. When the Communists launched the Tet Offensive in January of 1968, not only had Vietnam become the dominant issue in America, but Americans believed we were winning. But that was not so, as I reported on January 31st, 1968.
The enemy's well-coordinated attacks occurred throughout South Vietnam, but the most dramatic demonstration of his boldness and capability came at the very symbol of America's presence in Vietnam, the brand new U.S. Embassy building there.
At home, one man had become the lightning rod for the anti-war protesters' anger.
The enemy, we believe in all sincerity, is Lyndon Johnson.
In the New Hampshire Democratic primary, anti-war protesters, many of them college students, rallied around a man who at the time seemed the longest of long shots to become president, Minnesota Senator Eugene McCarthy. But McCarthy turned conventional wisdom on its head by coming in a strong second.
The big surprise in the first primary of Campaign 68 has been the strength of Senator Eugene McCarthy.
Now Johnson knew that something had to be done. Old friends were telling him he had to change the course of the war. So on March 31st, 1968, he addressed the nation.
Tonight I have ordered our aircraft and our naval vessels to make no attacks on North Vietnam, except in the area north of the demilitarized zone where the continuing enemy buildup directly threatens Allied forward positions.
Then, facing a brutal campaign, one he might not win, he ended with a stunning announcement.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
The twin bombshells seemed to bring results. In May of 1968, peace talks began.
We've come to Paris because one of the momentous news events of our time begins here tomorrow. The world may remember the Paris talks of 1968 between the United States and North Vietnam as the beginning of the end of a war that seemed to have no end.
But the talks bogged down from the beginning. So 5 days before the presidential election, Johnson made another dramatic announcement in an effort to get the stalled talks moving.
I have now ordered that all air, naval, and artillery bombardment of North Vietnam cease as of 8 a.m. Washington time, Friday morning.
It didn't help the peace talks, and it came too late to save Democratic candidate Hubert Humphrey.
So help me God.
The new president, Richard Nixon, dramatically changed the focus of the war. First, he ordered massive, secret B-52 strikes on neutral Cambodia to prevent the North Vietnamese from using it as a sanctuary. Then he announced that he was reducing the U.S. troop levels in Vietnam.
We have adopted a plan, which we have worked out in cooperation with the South Vietnamese, for the complete withdrawal of all U.S. combat ground forces and their replacement by South Vietnamese forces on an orderly, scheduled timetable. This withdrawal will be made from strength and not from weakness. As South Vietnamese forces become stronger, the rate of American withdrawal can become greater.
To support his policy of turning over the fighting to an uncertain South Vietnamese army, Nixon used the bombing in an attempt to reduce dramatically North Vietnamese infiltration of men and supplies.
The biggest single change in American military tactics in the past few months is something the U.S. won't even talk about, the tremendous increase in the bombing of the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos. When we told Hanoi we were halting the bombing of North Vietnam, we didn't tell them what we'd be doing with all that air power.
Parts of the Ho Chi Minh Trail and other targets in Laos were hit with 2.5 times as many bombs as were dropped over North Vietnam.
This is the heart of the electronic war against the Ho Chi Minh Trail. There is a forest of antennas collecting information on enemy movements along the infiltration routes in Laos and Cambodia. As one expert has described it, we have wired the Ho Chi Minh Trail like a pinball machine. Every night we plug it in.
I feel that it does a lot of good.
You think it's effective?
Of course it's effective, or they wouldn't be doing it.
But it wasn't effective. In the spring of 1972, the North Vietnamese launched a major offensive into South Vietnam.
The first question of the offensive: how did the North Vietnamese get their tanks, artillery, ammunition, and supplies into South Vietnam? American officials had been saying only 14% of the materiel leaving Hanoi was reaching its destination. Did this represent 14%?
Last night, in a grim television address to the nation, President Nixon announced his countermeasures to North Vietnam's current major attack on the South.
There's only one way to stop the killing. That is to keep the weapons of war out of the hands of the international outlaws of North Vietnam.
Haiphong Harbor, port of entry for communist supplies to North Vietnam since the war began. Now, for the first time, a declared American target in the latest escalation of that war. Along with the stiff action he's taken, President Nixon has taken care to offer Hanoi the bait of more attractive peace terms than he has hitherto publicly put forward.
To Nixon, the combination of heavy bombardment and a more favorable peace offer seemed to work. So much so that 5 months later, Henry Kissinger made a startling announcement.
We believe that peace is at hand. We believe that an agreement is within sight.
But it was not to be. The talks broke down. So Nixon ordered the heaviest airstrikes of the war, the Christmas bombing.
The president is convinced that only when Hanoi has suffered sufficiently will it be willing to negotiate seriously. The President believes he has some evidence for this view in the events of the past year, when the mining of the harbors and the blockading of the coastline of North Vietnam in May was followed in October by significant progress at the Paris peace talks. So a grim President Nixon has ordered the bombing to continue until the other side signals it is again ready for productive talks.
I'm going 8.5 what we want.
The difference in this campaign is that scores of big B-52s are being used for the first time in concentrated attacks around North Vietnam's heavily defended population centers.
Stand by to release. Ready now.
The 72 bombing was the first time I ever saw them scared when the B-52s came in. Took out all their SAM sites, took out all their anti-aircraft sites, and basically, after a week, were bombing at will. But you know, it didn't last that long, but it was a devastating experience for them to have these tens of thousands of tons of bombs coming down at them from this very high altitude.
In the space of just 11 days, the U.S. dropped over 20,000 tons of bombs on North Vietnam, more than all the bombs dropped between 1969 and 1971. Unlike Johnson, Nixon did not limit the target.
This portrait of Hanoi offers only part, but not all, of the story of the bombing, the part Hanoi once told. Military targets are completely omitted in this authorized film. This identified as Bach Mai Hospital. The other day, a Pentagon spokesman was asked whether the hospital had been hit. His reply, he still had no information on that.
Finally, at the end of January 1973, the Paris Peace Treaty was signed, allowing America to extricate itself from Vietnam. The agreement marked one of the few times the use of air power in Vietnam may actually have accomplished its objective.
I can only say that we resumed the negotiations on January 8th, and the breakthrough occurred on January 9th. And I will let those facts speak for themselves.
The agreement, though, turned out to be nothing more than a fig leaf to permit America to get out of the war. The air war in Vietnam was based on a strategy used in World War II, where strategic bombing was thought to be the key to defeating the enemy. But that strategy did not work in Vietnam, where there was no centralized industrial machine to wipe out. Thousands of civilians had been killed. 8,000 American pilots were killed in combat. Hundreds of others were captured. An American flyer, captured by North Vietnamese civilians, injured, bewildered, paraded through villages, beaten, humiliated, a prisoner of war. Scenes like this shocked Americans sitting in their living rooms watching on television. They saw part of the brutal reality that was Vietnam. By the time the Vietnam War ended for the United States in 1973, 591 Americans were prisoners of war, POW. 90% of them were airmen. Navy Lieutenant Commander Everett Alvarez was shot down in August of 1964, and he wasn't freed until March of 1973. He and his fellow POWs suffered unspeakable deprivation and torture. It was a monumental struggle just to survive. As the years passed, they finally became pawns in the bloody chess game of extricating America from Vietnam. For Navy Lieutenant John McCain, later as Senator from Arizona, the ordeal began when he was shot down over Hanoi in October 1967.
I ejected, according to observers later on, my shoot-up just went barely over a lake in the center of the city of Hanoi. And two of my arms were broken and my leg was broken. They took off all your clothes except your underwear. They took off all my clothes except my underwear and were jostling and pushing me around. One of them, all of them had guns. One of them stabbed me in the ankle with a bayonet, and another one stabbed me in the groin. And I felt a funny feeling in my leg, and I sat up and I saw it was sitting in a 90-degree angle, like that. I looked at it, and I remember saying, my God, my leg. And that one of them brought a rifle butt down on my shoulder, smashed my shoulder.
The brutality occurred because the North Vietnamese did not consider the pilots to be prisoners of war, but rather air pirates, war criminals. Pilots were tortured almost as soon as they arrived in the prison camp.
They had me in a stretcher. They put me on the floor of a cell on the stretcher and began interrogation. They carried me in the stretcher and interrogation when they would question me. And I would try to sit up in the stretcher, and when I wouldn't, they wanted military information. I wouldn't give any military information, so they began beating me up, but not too much because my condition was weak, so they would just knock me out.
In fact, it was only because the North Vietnamese found out that he was the son of an admiral that he was moved to a hospital. Injured or healthy, weak or strong, no one escaped torture.
And in 1967, I was tortured for 3 months. 92 days, which I spent in irons, ropes, and being beat about 5 times a day. And that was the worst actual physical torture.
They beat me on both sides of my face. And it was determined at one time they couldn't hit me hard enough with their left hands, so they concentrated with their right hand. By the time they were finished, I was bleeding from my left side, and all my left side of my face and head was blown up, and my eyes were closed. My left eye was closed.
During my captivity, during the first several days, I was tortured several times. In fact, one time I was hung. And I was hung to the point that I almost lost consciousness. My feet were just about clear of the floor, and the rope had tightened very definitely around my neck. I was cinched up, as Captain Denton explained, and kicked around quite a bit.
The net product that our captors wanted was propaganda.
People at the top said, look, we want war crimes confessions from these we call those air pirates, from these air pirates. And so, the word would filter down, and they'd try by convincing you, and by conversations and moral sway, away their persuasion. Well, that didn't work. Then they would resort to other tactics to try and get the same results.
Hanoi's purposes then also included having Americans acknowledge war crimes. This sequence showed Lieutenant Commander William Morgan Hardman, shot down in the second heaviest month of U.S. plane losses, August 1967.
This building was attacked by American Navy bombs and guided missiles. This building is located in the heart of Hanoi, in the most densely populated area. Though I myself had no direct part in this strike on a hospital, it's definitely, from the evidence I have seen, the work of Navy missiles, and my government is directly responsible.
But sometimes POWs tried to use their appearances to show they were still resisting. Jeremiah Denton, later a U.S. Senator from Alabama, used his appearance to let Washington know what was really happening inside the camps. Denton blinked his eyes rapidly, erratically, as if he were in shock. Later, Pentagon analysis showed something far different. Denton was blinking his eyes in Morse code, spelling the word torture. Navy Commander Richard Stratton bowed deeply to his captors, a highly exaggerated version of the Oriental Act of Respect. The appearance aroused world opinion because it appeared as if Stratton had been turned into a human robot. North Vietnam, ever mindful of what others thought, realized it had to change the image of the POWs it was presenting to the world.
Our first look at life inside a prison came from a communist source, an East German film crew in 1967. The Germans described this activity as, quote, not work, but exercise therapy. This camp is the model prison, the Hanoi Hilton, then housing perhaps 40 Americans. Among them, Lieutenant Commander Stratton. Stratton's appearance in an earlier propaganda film had boomeranged and generated world criticism of Hanoi. That was thought to be one reason for the production of this East German film.
They had me in this little teeny room that had water all over the floor. It was a filthy little room. And they came in one day. I'd been there about 3 or 4 days. And they said, we're going to put a cast on me. Put a chest cast on me. This arm raised up, chest cast on me, and took me into this other very nice room that had white sheets on the bed, and it was a well-lit, very bright room, and laying there, and they brought in this French film crew.
Let me know how you are treated here. I'm treated well here. I'm treated well by the doctors and the people here. How is your food? It's not like Paris, but I eat it. Then the last minute we have now, I should like to give it to you and your family. If you have anything to say to the people you love and the people who loves you, please tell it now. This time is yours. I would just like to tell my wife I will get well. I love her. I hope to see her soon. And I appreciate it if you tell her that. That's all I have. I'm sure that I will get well.
And one of the interrogators from the back said, behind him, I remember, said, tell him that you want to stop the war. And Chalet said, I think he's said enough.
The prisoners worked out an elaborate survival system. First, they observed a military command structure organized by then Captain, later Admiral, James Stockdale, who would one day become Ross Perot's vice presidential running mate.
First point I want to make is that at no time when we were in North Vietnam were we treated as prisoners of war. The Geneva Conventions of 1949 notwithstanding, we were, in the eyes and words of the captors, criminals.
As criminals, POWs were kept in solitary confinement, often for months, sometimes for years on end. They were, of course, forbidden to talk to one another, but they found a way using a simple tap code.
You could signal a tap code. You could even cough. You could. It turned into so many ways of in other words, for example, when I lived in the Hanoi Hilton, about once every 3 days they would pour water in the passageway. A guy would come out with a bamboo broom and sweep out. They'd have one of the prisoners come out and sweep out. Well, if you listened to him sweep, he would be sweeping the tap code. It makes a world of difference, mentally, resistance-wise, able to carry out orders, be able to communicate with one another.
By Christmas of 1968, North Vietnam's attitude had changed. So had the propaganda image it projected. Why? Well, partly perhaps because of world opinion, but more likely because President Johnson had ended the bombing. The shoveling and sweeping exercise therapy of 1967 had become gardening. At least that is what Hanoi wanted the world to see.
And that was just the beginning. As life for the POWs began to change dramatically. The Nixon administration decided to change the American stance toward the POWs.
Some 25 months ago, President Nixon decided to make an international issue of the Americans held by the enemy in Indochina, reversing President Johnson's policy of quiet diplomacy to try to free them.
If the United States should announce that we will quit, regardless of what the enemy does, we would have thrown away our principal bargaining counter to win the release of American prisoners of war. We would remove the enemy's strongest incentive to end the war sooner by negotiation.
But the war dragged on, and so did the peace negotiations. So the administration decided to act late in 1970.
A helicopter-borne team of 101 Air Force and Army volunteers raided the Son-Tay camp 23 miles west of Hanoi last November 20th. The venture freed not a single prisoner. There were none in the camp.
The POWs heard about the raid from newly shot down pilots.
It was a very, very important morale boost because it was concrete evidence that they were doing everything they could to get us out. And so that was, even though the raid itself was a failure, for our morale skyrocketed. willing to go to such lengths.
But if the Sante raid did not succeed, other efforts did. The wives and families of the POWs and missing in action became increasingly active, all part of the administration's campaign to go public with the POW issue.
The widening campaign of concern for the prisoners has taken many forms in the past 2 years. For example, small-town fairs. This one in Brea, California this month. High school students adopted missing Marine Captain Steve Hansen as their rallying symbol. As part of the POW campaign, the post office issued a special commemorative stamp. Perhaps fitting, for the biggest activity in behalf of the prisoners has been letter writing. Hundreds of groups like these school children have participated in Write Hanoi campaign. Millions of letters have been written. A delegation of 173 POW relatives went to Geneva, where 43 countries were represented at an International Red Cross meeting on the Geneva Convention.
Anything that we can do to further the world opinion with respect to these men's plight means a step forward. We tried many, many things, and we would do most anything to attempt to secure some new information or release.
Doing most anything included standing outside the site of the peace talks in Paris, where the prisoner issue was on the agenda for the 114th session. Hanoi's delegate Xuan Thuy arrived, but the presence of the families accomplished little. Nothing happened at the session to speed the return of the POWs.
Has any of this activity had any effect, do you think, on the North Vietnamese?
Well, I very definitely think that it has had effect, because up until December of last year, only 100 men had ever been heard from. Now, 339 men are identified by the North Vietnamese, which is some progress, and they are letting reporters into North Vietnam and have photographed a few of the men, and it does appear that the few that have been photographed, that their conditions have improved.
This was the first film of American POWs receiving mail, a reflection of Hanoi's changed public attitude toward the prisoners. Many of the letters contained snapshots. Stratton's wife, Alice, enclosed a photograph of their 3 boys, the youngest of whom doesn't remember his father. A few words bridging a distance halfway around the world. Major Roger Ingvelson of Sanford, Maine. Even the presence of the camera and the certain knowledge that he in this moment are being used for propaganda could not mask his reaction to a letter from home.
I think the bracelet wearers, the people who spoke out on our behalf, the wives and family members and others who went to Paris and met with the Vietnamese there, I think that had a profound effect. And the Vietnamese we went from conditions of solitary confinement and bare minimum subsistence to frankly being very well treated the last year or so that we were there. Put us in large groups of 40 or 50 each. I'd been in solitary confinement for I've forgotten how many years. He took us at night and took me from there into a room with about 30 other guys. It was an exhilarating experience. I mean, we literally talked for 2 or 3 days without sleeping or eating. Just talk. I think that was probably the happiest day, even happier almost than the day that I was released, because finally you were able to be with people. And a lot of these guys I tapped on the wall to for years. I'd never seen them.
But the actual release of prisoners still seemed a long way off. Over the years, the North Vietnamese did release a very few prisoners of war, always to peace activists from the United States who were visiting Hanoi.
I did not approve, and do not to this day approve, of some of the visits that American anti-war activists such as Jane Fonda and others made. I think there's a line that you cross, for example, to sit in an anti-aircraft emplacement and say you'd like to shoot down an air pirate, you know, that's wrong. But for some Americans, even if I might have disagreed with them or agreed with them, it's not important to demonstrate their views as to what they think is the best for the future of their country is a right that I was over there defending. If you didn't see any anti-war demonstrations in Hanoi, you know, and so it's important for us to recognize that we were fighting to preserve what in some ways, at least in the short term, might have harmed us some and helped the enemy.
On the last day of captivity, the prisoners were inspected by this Ceasefire's International Control Commission, a formation outside their cells, the half-dressed men grim, unsmiling. Then, seemingly to a silent signal, they marched to their cells. One grasped my hand in passing, only to have a guard break our grip. The paleness of the prisoners seemed to contradict the camp authorities' claim they exercised and played games morning and afternoon. He said, too, that the Americans fought among themselves, but mostly during basketball games. This inspection and the flock of American newsmen may have surprised the prisoners. They seemed somewhat dazed by it all, but the guards said they were told last week they'd be going home in a few days if nothing happened.
He was shot down on a combat mission on July 18, 1965, shot down over North Vietnam. Captain Jeremiah A. Denton, Jr. of the United States Navy. Being welcomed home by Admiral Guyler and General Moore. God bless America. God bless America.
It is with great humility and deep gratitude that we return today as free Americans.
Right behind him came the man who was probably the best known of this group of prisoners, Lieutenant Commander John S. McCain, III. He was also the most seriously marked by his 5.5 years of imprisonment. But his smile was broad as he saluted and shook hands with Admiral Guyler, who replaced McCain's own father, Admiral John S. McCain, Jr., as Pacific Forces Commander.
Of course I was happy, and of course we were overjoyed, but it had been so long. It's almost like when a kid waits for Christmas and it finally comes. Do you ever have that experience when you're a kid and it's not nearly as exciting? People thought, you know, they want steak or ice cream or caviar or whatever it is. I wanted to read. I wanted to read everything I could lay my hands on. My eyes would ache, but I wanted to know what happened in that intervening 5.5 years from 1967 to 1973.
The last American prisoner has left North Vietnam. The United States is closing the door on one of the most trying chapters of its history.
The scars from the air war in Vietnam have been long in healing because the policy was flawed. But the performance was not. Pilots performed superbly, carrying out extremely difficult missions. But what lingers is the death and devastation among pilots, among the Vietnamese, all in the name of a futile policy. Many Vietnamese still carry scars from the bombing. Many American POWs still carry scars from their hellish captivity. But many POWs manage to put their hardship and deprivation behind them and go on with their lives.
Listen, I enjoy every sunrise. I love every sunset. I'm fortunate to live in a state like Arizona where there's so much natural beauty. It really gives you a profound appreciation. I remember one time I was taken out to an interrogation. It was highly unusual. It was at night. Almost never did that happen. The Vietnamese were kind of like bureaucrats. They only worked during the day. So it was a special occasion. I'd forgotten even what it was about now. I remember walking outside and looking up and seeing the moon. And I thought to myself, you know, I haven't seen the moon in 3 years. You know, it's such a, it gives you such an appreciation.
And as the years pass, perhaps that appreciation for life and freedom helped McCain and the others wash away the bitter memories of the air war in Vietnam. I'm Mike Wallace, and this is the 20th Century.